Good morning, at least here in Cincinnati, a little different time for our speaker. We'll talk about that in a minute. I hope you had a wonderful lesson this morning with Arafili Nikolakopoulos. She led a lesson called Head Circles, and if you didn't do it and you're thinking you know what Head Circles is about, I bet you don't. So I hope that you tune into it and do it later in the 48-hour replay. Last night, we started the Neurological Challenges track with Susan Hillier on neuroplasticity, stroke, and traumatic brain injury. And we're going to continue on that track in a moment. But first, let me just say, I'm Cynthia Allen, if you don't know that by now. And you want to glance around your screen and find out how to participate in chat. Over in chat, not only can you talk with each other and introduce yourselves, but you can, chat along through the conversation, say what's interesting to you, what you're wondering about. We will use your chat to inform our panel discussion later today. Arlene Klein, our summit coordinator, will be over there. She's already introducing herself. And if you have problems, questions, you can also let her know about that through the chat or the Q&A, and she'll try to keep track of that. And she'll share some links for you towards the end as well that'll be helpful to you. So it's a great pleasure that I get to introduce you to Cindy Allison, who lives in Christchurch, New Zealand, and is currently working on her PhD on the Feldenkrais method and how it impacts spinal cord injuries at the University of Canterbury. And of course, that is her topic today, is the impact of Feldenkrais on spinal cord injury and living life with a spinal cord injury. She has worked with a number of people and with spinal cord injury. She's run awareness through movement classes, both privately and through the Christchurch City Council. And prior to becoming a Feldenkrais practitioner, she worked in a number of fields, which human resources, training, facilitation, computer programming. This is something that you've probably noticed as people are talking about their careers prior to being a Feldenkrais practitioner. Some people just start right out of high school, college, but many of us have a career ahead of time and then take a big veer. We'll hear from Cindy about why that was the case, because she has a very potent story. And she's got some interesting research as well that she's doing as part of her PhD that she'll get to introduce us to. So welcome, Cindy. It's nice to have you.
Hi, Cynthia.
So it's, I think it's a full 14 hours later over there right now. So you must be mid-morning.
It's about 9:45 in the morning over here.
Yeah, and the next day, yes. So, and we're over here heading into spring, and you're heading into fall.
Autumn, we call it, but
Autumn.
fall.
Autumn. Okay, good. So anyway, why don't you let us know a little bit about what inspired you to work with people with spinal cord injury? Because I think it relates to your own inspiration or reason for coming into the Feldenkrais approach.
Well, I first became interested in Feldenkrais because of my own experience. I had fibromyalgia. Well, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia and RSI. And the thing that I noticed the most, like one of the things was the pain was one of the issues, but another big issue for me was loss of proprioception or body awareness. So I noticed that a lot of my sense of where my body was in space was affected, and my functioning. So I was unable to do a lot of those things that I'd been able to do previously. So because of that, I found that I tended to do things like I would bump into tables, bump into chairs. I was unable to hold cups and things like that. I was frequently dropping things, but I was unaware at the time that this was due to a loss of proprioception. And it was during my explorations of things to help me, and I was finding there wasn't much that really helped me. I tried a lot of different techniques and methods, and nothing seemed to make much difference until I started exploring the Feldenkrais method, and in particular working with ways of restoring my body image. And during that time I started to find that my balance was improving. I was able to grip things again, my functioning was improving, and then I went on to train as a Feldenkrais practitioner. And I kept thinking that this would be really useful for people with spinal cord injuries, and I was very curious to try it. And then pretty much soon after I'd finished my training, I was approached by a family with a son with a spinal cord injury asking if I could work with them. So I said, well, I basically had next to no experience at that stage. I'd just recently finished my training, so I said I'd work with him for free. And one of the first things I did was I worked with trying to restore some sort of body image, and not knowing at that stage that he'd been diagnosed with what's called a complete injury. So by a complete injury, I mean you're supposed to get no movement or sensation below the injury. So he was injured at C4-5, which is fairly high up. So in theory, he should have had no movement or sensation below that. So I, in my naivety, started exploring, can I bring some sensation back to his foot? And I used something that I had found worked with myself, which was just doing very, very, very small circles on his foot. And my thinking behind that was that often when people are paralyzed or numb, I think people have the idea that nothing's going on for them. But my thinking was that actually there's a lot going on. There's a huge amount. There's a lot of, it's like when you go into a busy room and there's a lot going on. There's a lot of noise. And if you want to quieten the noise or send a message to the people in the room, you don't do it by shouting louder. Often what can occur is if there's too much noise, there's an overload. So what I worked with was trying to bring a very quiet message into the system.
That's fantastic. And I think I really agree with you that for most people that have some level of chronic pain, chronic numbness, or some kind of spinal cord injury, or really brain injury, as was talking with Susan last night, there's a lot of disorder, a lot of noise. Norman Deutsch talks about that in his book. So it's a great example of if you give them too much more stimulation, or you ask them to do something that's impossible for them to do, it just creates more kind of franticness in the system. It doesn't make order out of that disorder. It compounds it.
Yeah.
And for you, I want to back up for just a second, because I think you said something really significant about your own experience. So you look like you're a pretty high functioning person right now. You're finishing up your PhD. You said you couldn't even grip.
No, I struggled with. I could grip momentarily, but I found it very hard to hold things. So I was frequently dropping. So and also like if I went to pick up a cup, I would often miss and knock it over, and I found that I was daily spilling glasses of water.
Yeah. So I think this is just so key for people to hear, because there are people tuning in that are really quite desperate in a variety of different ways. And so you didn't have a spinal cord injury. You had, did you say repetitive strain and fibromyalgia, or?
Because that's the diagnosis.
Right.
I sort of think that sometimes, I was frequently diagnosed with fibromyalgia, but I think fibromyalgia basically means pain in the tissues, something like that. So
yeah, it might be a little bit of a catch-all diagnosis at this point. Yeah.
So I think what's more interesting is what's underlying that. So some people talk about changing their diet really helps, whereas for me, what helped, one of the biggest things was improving my body awareness and improving the way I moved.
Right.
And until I did Feldenkrais, nobody had actually addressed that with me.
Yeah.
I hadn't known that it needed addressing.
Right. And so you took what you learned for yourself. You had adapted for yourself something from the Feldenkrais work where you would do little small circles, it sounds like. And you.
Oh, yes.
And you did this for this young man.
Yes. So I'd done these small circles on myself, and I'd found that when I did that on my hands, where there was very little sensation in my hands, but when I started to do that, I got like very pleasant pulses up my arm, up and through my body. Actually, it sometimes went right down the whole spine. And I was very curious. I thought, I wonder if I was working with someone that was paralyzed, whether they would be able to feel this. So I thought there was about a chance in a million. It was just some idea that I had at work for me, but would it really work with someone with a not intact nervous system? So I tried it on this young man, and he said, I can feel you circling. I can feel you circling on my foot. And then he felt the same sensations what I'd felt, was like that pleasant electric current going up his leg. Sometimes he said it went up his leg and down his arm. And that happened frequently. And what I noticed as I did that was that the contractures, because a lot of people with spinal cord injury have quite significant contractures, started to release. And so I did that several times. Sometimes I do it on the right foot, sometimes I do it on the left foot. And I'd always get him to close his eyes and bring his attention to whichever foot I was working with. And one day I said, now I'm currently working with your right foot. And he said, oh, well, that's weird because it feels like my left foot. Well, in fact, he was right. And I had, so that clarified me that actually he was clearer than I was and what was going on.
That's good. I love that.
So, so that was
to me this week with someone with a stroke.
What's that? Oh,
it actually happened to me this week. So I said, where did I put your left shoe? He said, it's on my foot. I think it's on my foot. It was true. Yeah, I did have his left foot. I was really looking for his right shoe.
Yeah, you learn a lot from clients, I've found. So, so I went along in that way, and gradually, and he continued. Like one day, I was just chatting to him, and as I was chatting, I was just doing small circles on his hand between the joints in the hand, and but we were just chatting, and I wasn't really telling him what I was doing. And then when I stopped, he said, it feels like there are all these spaces between the joints in my fingers. So he could feel what was going on despite the prognosis that he would never feel that. So that was, and I do remember one day I worked with seeing if I could teach him to lift a finger. So we just worked with trying that, and we did eventually lift the finger. And then that night there was a thing on TV where they were talking about, it was a new research that was being done with stem cell therapy, and the man that was doing it said, if we can get them to lift a finger, that would be a miracle. And I thought, well, that's actually what we did today. So I continued to work with him. He noticed things like, one of the things I did with him was rolling, just rocking and rolling him on his bed. And he found that felt really pleasant. He could feel his whole body moving, and it really helped with the reduction of his spasticity. So from there on, other people started asking me to work with them. And again, my next client was a woman with a complete injury. Again, I didn't know her injury was complete, so in my naivety.
Could you say something about complete and incomplete for people?
Sorry. That with a complete injury, the prognosis is that they will get no movement or sensation back below the injury. With an incomplete injury, there's usually some expectation that in the next 2, maybe at the best 5 years, they will get some recovery. So they'll have, they may have movement below the injury and sensation. So I didn't know about this, so I'm pleased I didn't, because later on people told me that if someone has a complete injury, that nothing's achievable. But by that stage I'd achieved it with several people with complete injury, so I knew that not to be true. And of course there's the diagnosis. It could be a diagnostic error, that was, sometimes there is an error in the diagnosis, but it happened frequently enough for me to think that actually the diagnosis is wrong pretty much every time. I haven't come across anyone for whom the diagnosis has been right, if that is the case.
Oh, that's significant.
Yeah, I mean, I've only worked with I probably worked with less than 10 people with complete injuries, but I also know of stories from overseas of people who have made really significant recovery with, with quite severe diagnoses. So from there, I found that more and more people were asking me to work with them, and I ended up working. I remember about my fourth client was someone who had a complete injury, diagnosed with a complete injury, something like it was about 29 years before or something like that. And I remember feeling really confident, which surprised me. I thought I really felt that there was something I could do with this man. And I basically worked with getting him to learn how to sense and feel his pelvis. And he was moving his leg and rolling from the hip joint, rolling with his pelvis. And he could feel the hip joint for the first time. And he kept laughing. He said, they told me this was never possible. And he was actually an active man, so it wasn't like he'd been sitting there doing nothing for 29 years. He was a physically active man. He rang me the next day and said, he had a big day that day. He lived out of town. And he said, I went to bed last night, and for the first time for as long as I can remember, I didn't spasm when I went to bed.
Oh, wow. That is so significant for anybody who has these kinds of spasms. They're really hard. Well, they're hard for me to imagine how difficult they are. So yeah. I have a sense of it, and that is so significant, and I think one of the things that we were talking about with Susan was that when you're recovering from something like this, the Feldenkrais method can give a lot of hope. It doesn't mean that there's not work, and it doesn't mean that there's some kind of miraculous complete recovery or overnight, for sure, not the case. But for somebody who has not been able to sleep without spasms at night, that is miraculous.
Yeah,
that is a miracle.
So I have had at least another couple of clients who've told me, who've contacted me the next day and said, wow, my pain has gone or my spasm went. And often this would be temporary, but, at least it was the experience of not having that high degree of spasm was meaningful to them. Very meaningful.
So you've gone on to, you've worked with, more than a handful of people, and which is unusual, really, actually, for most of us. I was also talking about that with Susan, that I tend to be more of a generalist. I've seen a few, maybe 3 people with spinal cord injury, and I might have to be a little bit more than that in my 20 years, but it's not been a significant number. But you have certainly worked with more than that, and you've gone ahead and done some research.
Yes, so I'm currently writing up my PhD, and for my PhD, what I found was when I worked with individuals, I found that I often wanted them to be more independent. So like when you're doing functional integration, sometimes it may not give the person enough space to experience for themselves or to try things for themselves. So I wanted that. I also found that I like the idea of working in a group. I found that people with spinal cord injuries end up having a lot of treatment, and I thought what I wanted was something that was more like a group activity so that they could have all that comes with working in a group. The other thing was I found that often I would work with a client and they would say, oh, I can move my arm. And they would be, it was like sometimes they didn't make the connection with what I'd been doing because it seemed so subtle. And then I found that when I talked ATM to large groups, or
so ATM is awareness through movement for people who don't know that term.
Mm-hmm. So it's a group class format. So I'd found that when I taught classes with able-bodied people and they would get up at the end and they'd go, oh, my pain's gone. And then someone else would go, yes, mine has too. So having other people reinforcing your experience, I thought was also useful. So for my PhD, what I did, and there's also the cost, like it's cheaper for a person to go to an ATM than to attend an FI or an individual lesson. So what I did with my PhD was I developed an awareness through movement class aimed at people with spinal cord injury. It was in 3 phases. So the first phase was the development of the class. The second phase, I ran the program, a 12-week program with 5 people with spinal cord injury, all of whom were wheelchair users. And in the third phase, and basically during phase 2, the participants of the program gave me feedback on how they were finding it, what could be improved, whether there were any movements that were too difficult for them, those sorts of things. And then I ran the program again in phase 3 with a new group of 5 people. And in phase 3, I did a little bit of testing. So I looked at things like how far they could reach prior to the program, how far they could reach at the end of the program, and at follow-up and during the program. I also, prior to the program beginning, I got them to do an activity which was basically reaching to the left, and that's not to the left hand, for those that don't understand my Kiwi accent, not to the elevator. So seeing if they could reach to the left, when they reached to the left, what parts of their body were involved in the movement. I got them to fill in a picture, a drawing of what they could feel involved in the movement, and then I did that again at follow-up to see if there had been any change in how much they could feel of themselves. Because one of the things I found was it was very difficult for me to find a test of what I'm calling body awareness, because there seemed to be a limited amount of research in that area. And with spinal cord injuries, I found just about hardly anything at all. There's just a handful of articles, but there didn't seem, unless I'm looking in the wrong place, but I looked quite extensively. And I found that when I first worked with my clients, they didn't know, they hadn't heard of proprioception, they hadn't known of the significance of it. And the specialist, I'm getting off the topic of my PhD, but the specialist in the hospital had said to me, this is really good to see that someone's looking at proprioception because it's really been overlooked.
Excellent. Well, great. So you're going to be adding to the field of research, not only for Feldenkrais, but also for spinal cord injury. So that's really exciting, and in more than just one way. I mean, I think it's wonderful that it's Feldenkrais, but hopefully people will read this. Would it be called a pilot study?
Yes.
Yes, usually with PhDs it is a pilot study. We'll read that and get excited about the fact that proprioception can have a significant impact, and then look at a variety of ways to do that. Well, could you share a little bit about your research results then with us?
Okay, I can bring those up. So I'll just show you a lot of what my results were subjective. So a lot of them, I did quite a bit of interviewing, so people talked to me about their experiences and the changes they noticed in functioning and ease of movement. But the reach tests that I did were actually objective and quantitative. So I need to share that. Am I sharing it? No. Share. Can you see that now?
Yes, we can.
So what we've got here are Brindley plots, and some people may be familiar with them. What I've done is in the left-hand column, I've compared the baseline measure. So that was the measure prior to the program. I measured a couple of times how much they could reach in several directions, and I've compared that with on the left-hand side of where they were at week 6, and on the right-hand side, on the right column, where they were at the end of the intervention.
So just so I make sure I'm understanding, the diagonal line that's running through is basically a representation of where they were before they started the program?
Yeah, that basically represents where they would be if there was no change.
If there was no change. Okay, thank you.
So on the x-axis, you've got where they were at baseline,
Mm-hmm.
and on the y-axis, you've got where they were in week 6 and where they were at the end of the intervention. So in the upper square, we've got lateral reach right and left.
So lateral reach is in sitting, I assume they would be in sitting in their go out as far as they can and without.
Well, what I did with them was was a modification of something called a seated reach test.
Okay.
So I got them to sit alongside a table, and I had their wheelchair lined up against. I had it all lined up so that they were in the same position each time. Mm-hmm. And I had a piece of solder wire, a spool of solder wire, which they had to push along the table in the same way, from the same position every time. And they were not allowed to lean on the table. They were not allowed to lean on the solder wire. So they had to balance and push the solder wire along the table. Mm-hmm. So what I found is, if you look at the upper left square, and I've got both the reach to the left and reach to the right, it's at 6 weeks, halfway through the intervention. And you can see that all the participants, all that are above that diagonal line, which means that they all had improved in their reaching left and their reaching right. So we've got the circle represents the reaching left and the square represents reaching right. So by week 6, all of them had improved beyond the baseline. On the right-hand side, you can see where they are at the end of the intervention. And again, they had all improved beyond baseline. And you can see that the cluster of images has actually moved up a little. So by the end of the intervention, they'd improved even further.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And I would assume that this had a nice statistical significance.
Well, because I've only got 5 people.
Can't do that. Oh.
But one of the things that I have done is I compared it to, I could only find one study that I could actually compare it to, and that was a study done using the lateral reach test. It was a reaching to the right, but it was diagonally to the right. It was 45 degrees to the right, whereas mine was directly right. Mm-hmm. And what they said was any improvement beyond 10% of arm length was a significant improvement. So all of my participants were, at the end of the intervention, they were beyond, I just did it to the right, compared it to the right, and they were all beyond 10%. In fact, most of them were above 30 and one was around 50%.
Wow. Okay.
So there was one that was just above 10%. The others were well above 10%.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Then the next is, and then I did a follow up, and again, most of them, and I'm afraid I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but again, most of them were well above that 10%. The next is the rotation to the right and the left, and in that situation, what I got them to do was to push the solder to the left with the right hand and to the right with the left hand.
So they're reaching across themselves?
Yeah, so that means that's looking at can they rotate their trunk.
Yeah, okay.
Better.
Uh-huh.
So
if you could just put your mouse around the middle, could you move your mouse over there just so we're looking at the middle? Okay, so this is the middle set of diagrams. So this is a rotate and reach. Yeah.
So the lateral reach and tests are really a test of balance. These are really a test of how you can rotate. So again, you can see that all those images at week 6 are above that diagonal line, which shows that they all improved. And at the end of the intervention, you can see they've come up a wee bit higher still. So again, you can see that they've all continued to improve. The next one is forward reach. And again, you can see that they're all above that diagonal line. One of them not so far above the diagonal line, but and again, at the end of the intervention, they're all above that diagonal line. and slightly higher again. There was one more test I did, which I haven't yet done the Brinley plots for, and that was the upward reach. But again, it was the same pattern that people all improved. So they all improved on all 6. There were 6 measures, and they all improved on all 6 measures. So what I've got on the next page, one page down, no, there, I've got a couple of examples of, I also totaled all those 6 measures, and I've graphed them there for 2 of the participants 8 and 9, and you can see the blue line is baseline, so that's where they were at before the program started. So we did 2 measures at baseline, and the red line is where they were during the intervention. So I took one measure midway through the intervention and one at the end of the intervention, and you can see that they've both increased. In fact, they all increased, all participants increased during the intervention. And with these 2, with most of the participants, I did like a 3-week to 1 month or 3-week to 6-week follow-up, and they all had they were still all above the baseline at follow-up. These 2, one of them I did a 3-month follow-up and the other 3.5-month follow-up. So you can see that their totals were still well in excess of the baseline. They hadn't actually deteriorated much at all.
For people who are not used to hearing about research, one of the significant things is, can people maintain the improvement, or do they have to keep doing the intervention in order to maintain the improvement? And so that's, again, very encouraging, Cindy, very encouraging.
And although we didn't continue with the classes, some of them did some exploration at home, but certainly not intensive. They all said they didn't do nearly as much as they would have liked to have done, but they were certainly noticing differences. They were noticing differences in the way they did things, and that came up again and again. They would realise that, that's not so hard anymore, or I can do that differently. I don't have to do that in that difficult way. I've been doing it for 40 years or whatever. Not all 40 years, but somewhere more like 3 years or 10 years. And in fact, most of my participants were around about the 20-year post-injury mark. So they'd had their injuries for a long time.
Yeah.
That's of my 10 participants of the 2, phase 2 and phase 3. So the next page, I've got the body awareness diagrams. So here's for the top images are a picture of what they could feel in themselves when they reached to the left prior to the program beginning. And the diagrams at the bottom are what they could feel involved in the movement at the end. So that's for one participant. You can see at the beginning, they could just feel around about the arm and the ribs. By the end, they were feeling pretty much the whole body. So this is the next participant. Again, it's a similar thing. So notice now that they're feeling more down into the legs and feeling more of the torso.
Absolutely.
And, I've missed one. Did I show you that one? No, that was.
Oh, that looks different.
Yeah, so that's the other one. So again, you can see that this participant was feeling much more of themselves at the end.
Has to be just incredibly exciting for them.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I would get feedback from participants. I had like one participant in the first phase was diagnosed with a complete injury, something like, in the second phase, about 20 years before. And he was saying he was blown away by the fact that he'd never realised that his ribs and spine could be involved in movement in the way they were. So those were sort of the more objective things that I can show you that you can see. There were a lot of qualitative things that they talked about. So one of the things was ease of movement. They were blown away by.
Why don't you stop your screen share at this point, and then we'll.
Oh, yes.
That's okay. Go back to the larger screen. Yeah.
Okay, so they said things like that they were blown away by, and this is in both phases, both 2 and 3. I did qualitative study of both of those, and the sorts of things they were saying was they were continually blown away by how they did so little, and yet movement became so much easier. And sometimes they'd say things like, we'd be doing this a lesson, and I remember one saying, it felt like we did next to nothing, and yet now I can reach so much further. And they were amazed by that, the less is more approach. The other sorts of things they talked about was some of the functioning that they found it improved. So there were 3 of them out of the 10 participants. I did the ATMs on the floor, and the reason I did that was it's about funding, that I couldn't really, it would have been nice to have had tables that they could work on, but it meant that I had to get participants that could get from the floor into their chair. I had a couple of phys ed students who helped them get into the chair for those that had difficulty. And I found that at the beginning of the study, 3 of the 10 participants needed quite a bit of help to get from the floor into the chair. By the end of the study, all the participants could get into the chair independently. They didn't need any help from assistants.
That's a life changer.
Yeah. So other sorts of things they noticed was wheeling the chair. We had one who did sort of marathons, and he said his speed had improved a lot just by learning how to use more of his body. Before that, he's mainly used just his shoulders to move himself.
So he's doing a wheelchair marathon. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he found that learning to use his pelvis and more of his torso, it was easier, and he was going faster. And actually, just about that, one of the things I found too is often if someone's paralyzed, say above the neck, and they've only got maybe shoulder and arm movement, a lot of people will tend to focus on strengthening that which is already accessible or usable. A lot of my focus has been on going where they can't move, going where they can't feel, and finding that again and again and again there was something there. There was something that they could use. So, and I think that's really important for making movement easier, is I found again and again people were unable to use the pelvis, but once they started to have some sort of sense of pelvic control, then things would change for them. So other functions they found, rolling over in bed was another one. Sleeping, people found they'd sleep better. One said lifting is washing, walking, breathing, learning to coordinate their breath with the functioning, and of course reaching. They also reported that their balance felt better, their posture felt better. Occasionally in my study they reported decreased pain and spasticity, but I think for only a couple of the participants, for one, the pain and fatigue was sustained, so he noticed further on that he was getting less pain and fatigue, and others found that he was using, this is in the 3rd phase, that he was using less of baclofen, which is the spasticity medication. But for the others, it was intermittent, like where they would notice temporary reductions in pain or spasticity at the end of a lesson, but that wasn't sustained. But they all felt that if they continued to work with the method, then they would gradually get more control of those sorts of issues. Apart from my research, I also, as I say, worked with clients outside of my research, and again, it was similar sorts of things that people were finding. One of the things was increased confidence. Sometimes people said, when you don't have a good awareness of where your body is in space, it can actually affect your confidence. So having more of that awareness, more of that sense of stability increases your confidence. Another thing I found was that sometimes I would work with clients that were quite depressed in the early stages of the injury, and I was very careful never to give them false hope. I would always say, look, I don't know what we can achieve, but just let's see what's possible. And I found that often the parents because there was quite a few young men, the parents would say, he was depressed, but when you came along, or they'd go, no, there's nothing for me, Mum, or there's nothing for me, Dad, nothing's going to help. And then they would find that actually there was something, and that would lift their spirits. I think one of the big things I really wanted to achieve out of my research was that for people to, I wasn't so much interested in the outcomes, the physical outcomes of the research, was more the cognitive. I wanted people to recognise that there was another way of working, that they could have a bit of an understanding, a bit of curiosity about their own movement and continue to explore that. And as one participant said, she said, my study was a magical, mysterious sort of revelatory experience where she was learning more about herself. And that was the sort of feedback I loved getting, that people were going, oh, I discovered that. I discovered I can do this, that it doesn't have to be the way that it's always been.
Yeah. That's so key, isn't it? Just that's where hope, I'm not really sure if there's such a thing as false hope anyway, but where hope comes into play and it's most powerful is when you begin to realize some potential. You begin to see that the boundaries that you thought were fixed, which the Feldenkrais work we call habit. Right? We just, the boundaries that we thought were fixed, we call habit. And what happens after a spinal cord injury is, and the system is trying to figure out how to learn again, how to not be limited by the moment of that injury, that impact, but how can it continue to learn despite whatever anatomical structural changes that are present.
Yeah. Another thing I think is worth mentioning is, most of the clients that I've worked with has been short term, like through my PhD. So the intervention that I did, although it was over 12 weeks, the participants, the classes were an hour and a half a week, and the participants attended between 6 and about 10. Often they couldn't attend all of them. Usually that was because of health issues, things like hospitalizations, infections, all those things that people with spinal cord injury have to live with. Or maybe they don't have to live with them, but they certainly do. So participation is a very difficult thing for a person with a spinal cord injury. But what I did like to see was, despite that, at home, they were exploring. Not sometimes, they often said they all said they never did nearly as much as they would have liked to. They were all busy, but I think that's not unique to spinal cord injuries. I think we're all too busy to do all the things that we feel would be useful for us. So what I tried to do was to provide small things that they could practice at home, and some of them chose to do a lot, and some of them chose to make up their own things. But that everybody did something.
Well, once a week for 12 weeks is not a significant intervention for someone with such a challenging issue. And so, I think that can grab, somebody's attention to wonder if they can repeat these results. And I don't know, I've not done any looking at what's out there for, similar research for spinal cord injury. Obviously, you did a bit of that as you tried to figure out what could you compare to. And it doesn't sound like there's a lot even out there that's available to compare it to. But, somebody could do a study where they would take a look at traditional physical therapy side by side for 12 weeks with the Feldenkrais work. And particularly, it sounds like, you've come up with very respectful. I mean, I think it's a great use of the work, but it's also your own focus. The way you're focusing towards how to help people is probably more uniquely yours than you realize.
Sorry, I don't understand what you mean by that.
Well, I mean, I'm sure it's the Feldenkrais work, but it's your unique interpretation of it based on your experiences. And that's, so somebody could take a look at that and compare your unique approach to, say a physical therapy approach or an occupational therapy approach. It would be interesting.
There have been certainly studies which looked at reach with physical therapy, but why I couldn't compare them was they used a different measure. So they didn't use the seated reach. They used what you were describing, which is like a lot of them was reaching out that way, not pushing the shoulder.
Reach. Mm-hmm.
So that's why I had difficulty comparing. So maybe if I had my time again, I would use some of those tests.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I found, as I said, mine were just short interventions on the whole. When I had worked with my first client, the reason that he came to me was because his family had read a book by a man called Kevin Hitchcock. Now, Kevin Hitchcock had tetraplegia. He worked for Channel 10 or Channel 10 News in Sydney, or was it Channel 9? Anyway, he worked in the newsroom in Sydney. And he broke his neck and was told that he would never walk again. He wouldn't get a lot of his functioning back. He wouldn't get hand function. He had a man come and work with him who was an osteopath who had actually observed a Feldenkrais practitioner, Carl Ginsberg, working with people with spinal cord injury. And he used a lot of what he learned from Carl to work with this man. And gradually, Kevin ended up restoring. He worked intensively. He worked once he left the hospital. He continued to work, and he ended up getting hand function, walking, and all of these things again. And at the time, it was treated like a miracle. So it was in the papers because it was this miracle. This man that was not supposed to get this back had got it all back, and this was a miracle. And he decided that he wanted to write a book so that people would understand that it wasn't just something that just happened. There was a reason that it happened. So he wrote a book called Walk With Me that describes his experience. So that was what motivated my first couple of clients to do Feldenkrais, because they read the book and they sought out a Feldenkrais practitioner. Well, once I started working at the spinal unit, then I found that I had a lot of helpers. Like there was the library at the spinal unit, and the librarians there started looking for information for me. And one of the librarians found a woman called Molly Hale in America, who she too did Feldenkrais and a number of techniques that were all around body awareness. And she again was told, look, you're never going to get any better than this. And she's ended up managing to walk independently. I'm not sure how far, but she certainly far exceeded anything that was expected. So I kept finding these stories. I found that in Australia and America. I found another story for a woman from Germany. I ended up finding a woman in Switzerland who worked in a Feldenkrais practitioner who worked in Switzerland with people with spinal cord injuries. And so I found that there were these stories dotted around the world. And it seemed to me that often they were told, well, you were just lucky. And I wanted to bring those stories into one place. I wanted people to understand that it wasn't just luck. And as I found more and more stories, I found people that had spinal cord injuries that had actually become Feldenkrais practitioners. And again, when I started ringing these people and talking to them and finding again and again what they said was the first thing was the body image. Like restoring that body image was a really fundamental part of it. So and which is what was my experience. Like when I did my Feldenkrais training, I found a lot of the ATMs were very challenging for me. So I really had to slow it right down and feel, where is my pelvis? Where is, I seem to be slower at picking up where things were than my colleagues. And I think that maybe, and this is just my approach, maybe that's true with people with spinal cord injuries, that we really do need to really slow it down and really give them time to feel where they are in space.
Thank you so much. So I wonder, I know you've, in the bonus material, you've supplied 3 scans, but I wonder if you could lead us on maybe a brief little, I don't know, 2 to 5 minute scan. Would that be okay with you? So people could get a sense of maybe what you're thinking of?
Yeah, sure.
And let me just pull up. Something that we can take a look at while you're leading us.
So how long would you like me to go for?
No, somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes.
Okay. So close your eyes. And just gently squeeze your right eye. Squeeze the eye and let it go. Do that a couple of times, just squeezing your right eye and then let it go. And then squeeze the left eye and let it go. And do that a few times, squeezing the left eye and then let it go. And as you do that, notice the effect that has on your neck. Notice the effect it has on your face. Can you squeeze just the eye, or does the whole face involved? And now squeeze both eyes and let them go. Notice what happens in the shoulders as you squeeze the eyes, and your tongue. What about the length of your neck? Does it affect your breath? And with your eyes still closed, look forward. So you've got your eyes in front of you, and then turn your head to the right with your eyes forward and back again. So your eyes are looking forward and closed. You turn your head to the right and back to the center. And notice the effect that has on your eye sockets and on your neck. Can you feel the eyes move in the sockets as you turn your head? And then turning it to the left and back to the center. How do you breathe as you do that? Can you continue to breathe, or do you stop breathing? Do you breathe in as you turn, or do you breathe out? And now notice how you're sitting. Notice the width of your shoulders. How balanced do you feel? Can you feel the position of the relationship between the position of your right shoulder to your right hip, and the relationship of the left shoulder to the left hip? Is your right shoulder to the right of your right hip, or maybe to the left? Is one shoulder more forward than the other? And now tilt your head to the right and back to the center. And do that a few times, tilting your head to the right and back to the center. And as you do that, notice what happens in the ribs. Can you allow your ribs to open up on the left and close on the right? So your head's moving closer to your right hip. And now tilt your head to the left and back to the center. And again, can you allow your ribs to open on the right and close on the left? And now bring your left shoulder forward and your right shoulder back. Doing that a few times. Come back to the center, bring the left shoulder forward, the right shoulder back, and then bring them back to the center. And as you do that, breathe out as you bring your shoulder forward, and breathe in as you come back to the center. What happens to your head and ribs as you do that? Can you notice a change of the relationship between your shoulders and your hips? And feel a rotation in the trunk. And then do the reverse, so bringing the right shoulder forward and the left back. Again, breathing out as you do so, and breathing in as you come back to the center. And now bring your attention to your sitting bones. And notice how you're balanced over your sitting bones. Are you more on one side than the other? Maybe you're further to the right or to the left. And now, keeping your head in the center, transfer your weight onto your right sitting bone. If you can't do that, just imagine that you're doing it. So your head's in the center and you're transferring your weight onto that right sitting bone and then coming back to the center again. And feel again, as you do that, can you allow your right side to lengthen? Your ribs open on the right side. And then transfer your weight onto your left sitting bone. Again, keeping your head in the center. And again, allowing your ribs to open. And notice the effect that that has on the head and shoulders. And then finally, bring your attention to your right foot and your left foot. And notice how your weight is distributed over your right foot. Is it tilted maybe to the right, to the left? Is it more on the front of the foot? The back of the foot? And the same with the left foot. How is your weight distributed? And then breathe. And bring your attention to your whole body. Just noticing how you sit in your chair now.
Wow, that was so relaxing. I don't get to do much that's that relaxing within the summit, so I hope everybody else enjoyed it, because I certainly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy. So we're going to be starting to wrap up here for this particular session. And I would like to remind you that we will be coming back at noon. and finishing up this track of around, I can't even quite think, actually. So you got me so relaxed. I'm like, I'm not sure what I'm talking about anymore. So let me find my notes because I'm going to need to. Oh, yes, we're coming back to talk at noon with Marg Bartuszek about a new movement map for people with Parkinson's disease. Cindy has it's kind of a long URL for us to just say out loud, but we're going to put it in the chat for you, and there you can find some access to some of her audio tracks, which she's developed to help reduce pain and increase awareness of where you're at in space and about your body. So you can find that link also if you're listening to this later on the replay by just going to feldenkrais.summit.com and clicking on Cindy's name, and that will take you over to her speaker page, and at the bottom we have information about her as well as the link to her cindyallison.bandcamp.com/releases. And then also she'd like you to know that about the New Zealand Feldenkrais Guild website, which is feldenkrais.org.nz, NZ for New Zealand, of course. And I also want to just encourage you that if you would like to have more of this kind of goodness from Cindy, she does have 3 bonus lessons that she's provided in the all access upgrade. And if you upgrade while the summit is still going on, you get $25 off of that fee, and that includes access to all these talks, because we know you can't listen to everything. At least I don't think you can. Maybe you will be able to. But you'll get access to all of these to listen to at your leisure instead of having to try to fit this tight schedule, as well as the bonus material, transcripts. And so it's a lot of really good quality material. So Cindy, I want to thank you so much for enlightening us about what the potential is for people with spinal cord injury. I think it's quite encouraging. Thank you for choosing this as your research project and really taking it on as something that you've wanted to explore. I think it's a very nice contribution to our work, and it's certainly a nice contribution to people who are struggling with that challenge and looking for options.
Thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, so see you back here maybe in just not quite, I guess, 3 hours. So look forward to it. Goodbye.
Bye.